Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Brian Motherway. I'm here at the headquarters of the International Energy Agency. We're delighted to be hosting today's event, which I think will be a really interesting discussion. We're pleased so many of you have been able to join us on Zoom for this discussion on engaging citizens as decision makers in clean energy transitions. So many countries are focused on higher levels of ambition around clean energy, introducing really interesting and important and societally significant policies right now. And of course, in the context of energy being such a focus for governments around the world, as well as climate, it's a really important time to make sure that the policies have the buy-in of citizens, have learned from the wisdom and the experience of citizens, but also fully engage them in dialogue to understand what the right policies are, how to design them, how to implement them, and how to enact clean energy transitions that really bring the maximum benefit to everybody. That clean energy transitions that create jobs, that enhance well-being and social and economic development, that enhance people's lives, enhance energy access and affordability, and of course, address the very pressing and urgent climate crisis we find ourselves in today. So the range of panelists we have joining us today come from every corner of the world and have done some really interesting things in relation to hands-on experience in engaging citizens or examining and observing those processes. So we're going to learn a lot about what's been going on in different parts of the world in the last few years and how we can learn from that, particularly how governments and civil society can work together in future activities related to involving citizens, enhancing the public debate and making sure we're getting policy design just right through democratic participation. So the way we'll do this is I'll introduce these panelists in turn, ask them a question or two that will help set the context, and we'll hear about their experience and some of their thoughts, and then we'll do some questioning among the panelists and follow up on some issues. And those of you joining us on Zoom, you're very welcome to make an input if you wish, by asking a question or making a comment through the chat in Zoom. So do feel free to ask a question. If I can, I'll get to as many as I can in the time allows. So I can't promise I'll get to your question, but we do really want to hear your views. And if we don't get time to cover it today, we're very keen to continue this as a live conversation. We're very happy to follow up with any of you afterwards after today's discussion on these issues. So let's not waste any further time. Let's go to our first panelist. And Shirley Dodd deserves a special word of thanks because it's 5:30 a.m. where she is. And Shirley, we really appreciate you coming to us so early in the morning in your time zone. Shirley is the executive director of, if I get this right, Wash. I hope I've got that at least close to right. You can correct me. But it's really interesting because it's the first sectoral part of Natural Resources Canada to be given an Indigenous title, reflecting its work in terms of engaging Indigenous communities in consultation around key issues such as the ones we're talking today. So maybe, Shirley, thank you for joining us. Maybe you could correct my pronunciation and tell us a little bit about the work and remit of what you're doing there in Canada, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. And thanks to the IEA for inviting me to be part of this panel today. I'm very excited to hear from my fellow panelists and to share some of the work that we're doing here. As you say, I work in Crown Indigenous consultations for Wash, which is a sector of Natural Resources Canada. That's part of the Government of Canada. And we are the very first part of the entire Government of Canada to be gifted an Indigenous name. Wash is an Algonquin word for sweetgrass, which is a sacred plant and important medicine to the Algonquin. And our capital city of Ottawa sits on Algonquin territory. Sweetgrass is important because a single braid of sweetgrass is very fragile, but when braided together like this, it's actually very strong. We met with a council of elders many times and had sharing circles and gatherings to discuss our mission and our mandate and our vision. And that's out of that came the name. Canada has set some very ambitious climate goals, and reaching net zero emissions is going to require that many major infrastructure projects are built or expanded, most of which are going to be on the traditional territory of Indigenous people. So as a result, clean energy transition in Canada requires Indigenous inclusion and partnership. And in Canada, we actually have a constitutional obligation. It's written in our constitution that if we contemplate, we as the Crown, and the Crown is a term we use in Canada because we're a constitutional monarchy, to describe the nonpartisan idea of the state and the government. So it transcends when a government changes. So when the Crown contemplates an action, such as approving or building a project that may impact inherent or treaty rights, we have a duty to consult with Indigenous people. And a very high standard of consultation has evolved in Canada over the last 20 years, mainly through court decisions as they contemplate exactly what is meant by good governance, the honor of the Crown, and reconciliation. But outside of our legal obligations, Canada has committed to proactively build relationships and pursue reconciliation in order to ensure that Indigenous groups can play a meaningful role in the just energy transition and advance both environmental stewardship and their economic interests. So Nukwaywashk and the entire Department of Natural Resources Canada have a really important role to play in ensuring that Indigenous people are part of the natural resource sector and that we can pursue economic reconciliation, because Indigenous groups have been very, very, very clear with us that they want a seat at the table at the very early stages of project development, especially in terms of exciting new areas of projects, in terms of solar, hydroelectricity, geothermal, and critical minerals. And they also want to ensure that projects in their traditional territories are conceived of and developed and proceed in a way that respects and does not negatively impact their traditional ways of life. So I really look forward to being able to talk about some of the initiatives and some of the work that we've done, and particularly some of the lessons we've learned over many years of perhaps not doing it as well as we'll be doing it in the future. So thanks for having me here.
Thank you very much, Shirley. And Nukwaywashk is a really interesting initiative and a really interesting organization. And before we come back later into more detail, let me just start with one question, which is about how the Crown and the government, excuse me, how did you establish trusting relations with the Indigenous communities, who I suspect probably didn't feel adequately consulted before you put this extra emphasis and before you created these new structures? There must have been a period of relationship building and trust building, in terms of reaching that point where you get a meaningful, genuine exchange and participation.
It's ongoing. It's a continual process of relationship building and trust building with Indigenous groups. We have hundreds of Indigenous groups in Canada, and obviously I haven't worked with all of them, but it's like building any relationship, and our relationship has historically not been a great relationship, the Crown, with Indigenous people in Canada. So it's a continual process of providing information early, being consistent, and building a good relationship.
Thank you very much, Shirley. And there's several things I want to come back on, but let's go to our next panelist now to hear a different perspective from, indeed, my own home country of Ireland. And we're very pleased to be joined by Arthur Leary, who is the Secretary General of the Electoral Commission of Ireland, as well as being the interim CEO of the Irish Electoral Commission and Secretary to the Citizens' Assemblies on Biodiversity Laws. And Art, we're very pleased you're able to join us, because Ireland has some really interesting process going on over the last few years of using citizens' assemblies in a number of topics related to climate, but relating to many other things as well. And of course, most recently in relation to biodiversity. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that experience.
Certainly, Brian, great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm coming to you now from a wet and windy Dublin, from Citizens' Assembly headquarters. And if I could just draw your attention, perhaps, if I can, to the Irish language version of the Citizens' Assembly on Tunnel Seranach. The literal translation of those words is a gathering of free people. And that's exactly what we're all about. There is an elegance to the Irish language which makes you weep sometimes, which is probably why we've won 4 Nobel Prizes for literature in the last 100 years. 10 years ago this week, Brian, I gazed into a sea of 100 faces for the first time. most of whom I'd never met before, and said, we have some problems and we're not sure what we're going to do about them. Can you help us? And that was the start of the Citizens Assembly journey. The Citizens Assemblies have gone from being an academic exercise into part of the government's infrastructure as a way now of getting hard jobs done. They have transformed Irish society. In a short 10 years, we've used citizens' assemblies to deal with the intractable problems of abortion, marriage equality, really sensitive social issues, which the political system was not able to get to grips with for the previous 60 years. You mentioned the climate change. The Climate Change Citizens' Assembly produced recommendations which became the government's climate action plan, which ended up in legislation setting our legal targets for the achievement of reduction in carbon emissions. There is a hunger in the world right now. There's a momentum out there for citizens to become involved in decision making, and the political systems also want to encourage the citizens to get involved in how decisions are made, because we need to arrive at policy frameworks and decisions which the population are happy with. And as a sign of this hunger, I suppose, in the last 8 months, I have spoken in 21 different countries at their request in relation to Ireland's story. And Ireland has a great story here in relation to this. We have had, as I said, a number of citizens' assemblies, 5 in total, the most recent being the biodiversity loss one. And it has achieved many, many things. There have been referendums, legislation, etc. We've answered dozens of questions, and it is now part of the way that we do things. So people ask, well, why does it work? It works because we pay attention to 3 big things. And if you take away anything from today's message, it is these 3 issues. Not every issue is suitable for a citizens' assembly. It's the first thing to bear in mind. Don't go running to a citizens' assembly on every single problem you have, because in your sphere, you might legitimately ask an assembly, is nuclear power an appropriate energy source for a country? And that could be something you would ask 100 randomly selected people. Would you ask them to design a nuclear power station? Absolutely not. You know, there are things which should be left to experts, but most issues citizens can seem to get a grip on. The second big issue is that the room of your 100 people should be absolutely representative of your society. You know, some of this stuff is very easy. We work on gender, age, and region to start with. So we have 51 women and 49 men on our assembly. We have 28 people from the city of Dublin, because that's representative of the population. We've got 11 people from the age of 18 to 24, again, mirroring the population. But we also delve a little deeper. You know, 4% of our population are farmers. So we've got 4 farmers in the room, and 3% of our population is unemployed. We've got 3 unemployed people in the room, 11 people with a disability, 17 people in the room who were not born in our country. So what we're trying to establish is Ireland in one room. What has happened in many, many countries who have tried this in recent years is that they have failed on that score, because the room wasn't represented enough. Their method of recruitment and selection of these people didn't work, and therefore the recommendations weren't accepted. Just a quick example on that. For our abortion referendum, the Citizens' Assembly made a recommendation which went way beyond what the political system thought might work with the Irish people. And there was consternation. You know, they recommended quite a liberal abortion regime, and they voted at the Assembly 67 to 33 in favour of this new regime. When the matter was put to a referendum, the result was 66-34, which proves 2 things. One is that the room was representative of the Irish people, but more interestingly, perhaps from your perspective, is that the people were way ahead of the politicians in their thinking on this issue. And this has happened. Irish politicians pride themselves on their closest to their constituents, but there are blind spots here, and you should take advantage of the wisdom of crowds, as the behavioral economists call it now. The third issue is outcomes, how you manage outcomes. Again, another mistake that everybody made. Listen, in the country you are in now, everybody knows what happened to the climate change recommendations that happened in France. That was a particular difficulty because the citizens were led to believe that all of their recommendations would simply be implemented. And when that became a problem, then it's a very Irish result. You turn good news into bad news. Be very, very careful about how you explain what you're going to do with the recommendations. We're very good about it in our country. We have a debate in Parliament where the government comes in and they announce which recommendations they're going to accept and which recommendations they can't, and they explain the reasons why. So nobody's under any preconceptions. And the final thing I would say is that it's really, really important when you have the 100 people in a room and that you listen to all perspectives. You know, the biodiversity loss assembly is a particular case in point because the environmental groups were very keen to come in and say, well, here's a list of all the problems. We're all going to die unless we do the following actions. But there is another side of this story. We heard from farmers and foresters and turf cutters and energy companies and everyone in relation to this issue. So the citizens got the full perspective. They heard all perspectives, and that's so important that they hear all voices and that everybody is treated the same. We've had some great experiences dealing with sectors, and if I could just single out one of the people who is watching today, Pork Sline, who works in the industry in Ireland, their relationship and their engagement with the Citizens' Assembly on climate change is a model that we should all look for. People come in and explain their position. They're not defensive, but they're open and transparent in their engagement as well. And I would encourage any of you who get involved in this process to do exactly that. Citizens have an interest in this, and if you give them enough information, you can trust them to make the right decisions. Thank you. I've probably gone a little over, but I thought that gives an encapsulation. I can't stay for the full meeting, but my colleague Tim Carey is here. He was in charge of program development for the Biodiversity Loss Assembly. He'll be delighted to deal with any questions of detail which arise in the rest of the session.
Thank you very much, Art, and thank you, Tim, also for joining us. And I should mention, actually, that I had the pleasure and privilege of participating in the Climate Change Citizens' Assembly in Ireland about 4 years ago. I was able to visit back from France at the time, and I really enjoyed it and found it very uplifting. And Art, if I may, before we lose you, ask you one question, because I think this is a question probably on a lot of people's minds when we hear from you about how influential and how well established this has become. But it's only a decade, as you said at the start. 10 years ago, the idea of a Citizens' Assembly was an abstract academic idea. Now it seems to be, the way you describe it, a pillar of Irish political processes and decision making. Just say a few words about that journey from how they've become so well established and so well regarded as part of the process.
Yeah, nothing succeeds like success, Brian. It's as simple as that. The political system discovered that there is now a mechanism in place that can deal with some of the really difficult, intractable political situations. We weren't able to have a conversation, a civilized conversation about abortion for the last 6 years. And this group of 100 people turned up and made a recommendation that the government was able to stand behind, and it worked just fine. You know, because historically we developed policy in our country, and it's something that we borrowed from our British neighbours. You know, that we develop policy by political parties bring their manifestos to government, and so they have ideas. They use people in grey suits like me all over the civil service who are experts as well to tease out all the policy issues and make recommendations, and then they engage with stakeholders, with people who have an interest in it. All we have done with citizens' assemblies is add a fourth leg to this three-legged stool. We have included citizens. So this isn't a replacement for parliamentary politics or for politics at all. It's not a threat. It's just an additional mechanism that enhances the policy development and decision-making process. And as I said, it works. There were very low expectations. The first call I got, I won't say who it was from, saying, listen, I have a job for you. We have this thing in our program for government, which is never, ever going to work. but it's in the program for government, so we have to do it. But we think you might be the guy to go and do it. And I spoke about it, and at the end of the conversation, I said, well, listen, have I got you clear here? As long as I don't kill anybody or spend any money, I can do whatever I like with this Citizens Assembly. And this individual says, I knew you were the man for me. So that's how it started, and it has come. And in 10 years, as you know, Brian, I mean, constitutional change doesn't happen quickly, and it happens very slowly, and as it should. But this is a very, very short period in which this thing which didn't exist, as you said, 10 years ago, was now become part of the institutional framework.
All right, thank you very much. It's fascinating, and thanks for joining us under time pressure. Tim, we'll come back to you in a few minutes and hear a little bit more about the Irish case. But before that, let's go to Korea, to Seoul in Korea. And we're very pleased that we have joining us today Dr. Yeonji Kim, who is the president of the 1.5 degree Plan Lab and also the former director of the Citizens Energy Cooperation Division of the Seoul Metropolitan Government. So Dr. Kim, thank you very much for joining us. Very keen to hear your perspective. And maybe I could start by asking about your experience as the director of the Citizens Energy Cooperation Division. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about Seoul's experience with engaging citizens on climate change and clean energy transition related issues, please.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And thank you very much. I think engaging citizens as decision makers is very important issue. Sorry, my English is poor, so I will read the document, the material I prepared. So I'm very honored to join this webinar today. I was a former director of Energy Citizen Cooperation Division in Seoul Metropolitan Government from 2015 to 2021. I oversaw people-centered energy self-reliant villages, eco-mileage, and other citizen cooperation policies for the One Less Nuclear Power Plant Initiative. Seoul is a mega city with 10 million people. Seoul consumes a large amount of energy. Seoul's power consumption increased by 12% from 2006 to 2011. So in 2012, One Less Nuclear Power Plant Initiative started. It was the comprehensive Seoul Sustainable Action Plan implemented from 2012 to 2020. The initiative aimed to reduce energy consumption by 2 million TOE by 2014, which is equivalent to the amount of energy generated from one nuclear power plant for 1 year. When it had successfully done, in 2014, the second phase of the initiative was started, which aimed 4 million TOE. That's the amount generated from 2 nuclear power plants produced. And it was also achieved in 2020, which was target year. One Less Nuclear Initiative was a citizen-led energy transition policy. About 100 programs were conducted. The most successful area was energy conservation through citizen participation. The number of energy-saving citizens increased thanks to various programs. The initiative demonstrated that a local government can also become a key player of national energy policy. And it demonstrated the example for local government's role in leading the citizen-led energy transition. So I'd like to share the understanding of climate change in a town, in a village. So the Energy Self-Reliant Village Program. How can an energy self-reliant village can be possible in a big city like Seoul? We chose the energy transition movement, a community of over 50 households can apply for designation as an energy self-reliant village. If approved, the community receives small subsidies like just the seed money for energy community building, and they got consulting services on how to practice it. Among the various energy transition programs under the One Less Nuclear Power Plant initiative, residents could find and apply the proper programs fitted in their villages. People planned and grew the village on their own for energy transition. The communities work on three-step approach. Step 1, save as much energy as possible. Step 2, raise efficiency. Step 3, adopt solar panels and renewable energies. Very simple. But energy self-reliant villages were evaluated every year, and excellent villages can operate for up to 3 years. We focused on their education because villages, well-educated and had a strong community, performed better outcomes in energy saving and production. So we helped the community study together to make a shared understanding of climate change and energy problems of Korea. Second, they implemented to solve these problems. Third, they experienced together what kind of practice show effective among what they did. While engaging in various programs like energy self-reliant villages, citizens grew up to be advocates who not only participate in the program, but also fully understand, support, and promote the One Less Nuclear Power Plant initiative. Well, I introduced energy self-reliant villages and OL MPP initiative briefly. During the discussion, let me talk more about how we made the decision with the citizens. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Yanji, and congratulations. It sounds like a really successful initiative and set of initiatives you have there in Seoul. So yes, certainly we will come back to the question about what you've learned and how it succeeded. So I'm looking forward to talking to you again in a little while. But let's go now to Indonesia next. Very pleased to have Arianto Nugroho with us, who is the national coordinator for the organization Publish What You Pay Indonesia. So Arianto, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. And let me start by asking you about the context in Indonesia, because we know that Indonesia has really commendable ambition for a pathway towards net zero, changing its energy system, creating new opportunities for Indonesian citizens and workers in a clean energy context. And of course, we in the IEA are delighted to be working with you in so many ways, including publishing a net zero roadmap for Indonesia quite recently, while you were, president of the G20 group last year. So with all of that activity and with all of that great ambition, do you feel that across the population of Indonesia more broadly, there's an understanding of this ambition and what it means for Indonesian citizens?
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. I would like to say thank you for this opportunity to share our experience of this important and interesting event. My name is Arianto Nugroho. I'm National Coordinator of Publish What You Pay Indonesia, a civil society coalition with 29 members of CSO for transparency and accountability in the energy and the natural resources sector. I would like to start with the context of latest G20 presidency. This process is important because G20 countries are responsible for about 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions, including from land use change and forestry. To align with SDGs number 7 and the 1.5 pathway of the Paris Agreement, the share of renewable energy and electricity generation needs to be increased at least 75% by 2040, and the share of unbated coal reduction to zero. One of the results of the Energy Transition Working Group and the Energy Transition Ministerial Meeting in the G20 reached an agreement to endorse Bali Compact, common principle in accelerating clean energy transitions. Bali Compact is the basic principle that serves as a foundation and reference for all G20 members in carrying out their respective national energy transition plans. the energy transition is expected to shape the future of resource-dependent countries, impacting government revenues, investment decisions, and development at the local level. While some areas may benefit, for example, increased strategic mineral investment, others may face economic losses where there is a transition away from fossil fuel productions. The transition to a low carbon economy will have implications for the world's dependence of fossil fuel as an energy source, as well as strategy mineral supplies key to increasing the use of renewable energy and electricity batteries. The basic question is, to what extent civil society, particularly communities, most of which are located in the remote areas, could be involved in the making policy decisions, implementing as well as monitoring and evaluating the energy transition process so that it's truly of a just energy transition. Reflecting on our experience, the issue of the energy transitions, including what was discussed in and the result of the last G20 meeting, has become quite a public discourse. However, this discourse is still at the upper or middle class level in big city, but does not become an issue in the local or grassroots level. In fact, communities at the site level, including women, children, indigenous people, and other vulnerable groups, are the group most affected by this energy transition process. So still just discussed in the middle class or in the big city. In Indonesia, regarding to the policy making process, a safe space for the civil society, particularly communities, including local government, is still very limited. For example, a number of laws in the energy and natural resources, for example, the mining and alcohol law, the omnibus law, and the renewable energy bill have always been controversial in terms of the transparency and participation aspect. Furthermore, regulation and policies drafted at the level of government's regulations or ministry regulation are still far from involving civil society, especially affected communities. And also in the past 5-6 years ago, a number of local government authorities in the energy and natural resources sector were revoked and taken over by the central government. Although the government has claimed conducting public consultations, provided an online complaint handling mechanism, however, again, affected communities who are in the remote area do not have access to involve or to participate in the context of making policy making. In our perspective, the definition of good governance, namely transparency, accountability, and participation, must be linked to the right of the citizens. Transparency is meant to ensure the right to know, accountability to ensure the right to claim, and participation to ensure the right to be involved. So that the government provide information through websites or other channels, it does not mean that citizen right to know have been fulfilled when the affected community couldn't access it. So transparency is not, the meaning of transparency is not of government provide information, but how the community could access the information. Currently, we are running the program of engaging communities in just a transition through EITI implementations because Indonesia is one of the EITI countries implementation, which aim to see the impact that occurs at the regional level to the community level from the implementation of the energy transition, especially in areas that have extractive potential and activities on natural resources at the local level. We work in the North Morowali Regency, which are known to have the largest nickel contents in Indonesia and have started to activities of the battery manufacturing industry for the implementation of automotive, electric current storage, and energy storage. We already finished a preliminary study from this project with several findings. The first one, the community at the community level is not aware of the issue of energy transitions. Community around the mines do not know how about Paris regulation related to mining government or energy transition, including the policy making process. Communities around the mines or around the energy transition for the renewable energy do not know much about information of production volume, production values, revenue from the tax or non-tax revenue, sharing revenue funds, and etc. Communities just aware, for example, from in the area of critical mineral, just aware the information regarding CSR or employment. So this is two information that's interesting by the communities. We also have several recommendations. Socialization is needed from the central government to the provincial and regency regarding the importance of transparency and accountability in the energy natural resources sector. promoting related the EIT initiative, because the EIT initiative have two principle: transparency, and the second one is to develop the multi-stakeholder. So we encourage the multi-stakeholder forum not only in the national level, but also in the province and the local level. The government need to encourage dashboard for transparency and accountability facilities for evaluating the implementation of energy transition commitment to the province and district city level that can also be used by the community. There need to be more frequent multi-stakeholder forum at the provincial and district level by involving the community and the other stakeholders such as local ombudsman, local transparency committees, journalists, and local NGO. I think it's enough from us, and thank you.
Thank you indeed, Arianta. That's really interesting. And it's really interesting to get this particular Indonesia perspective on this in the context of the scale you're dealing with, but also the level of ambition. So congratulations on that work, and we look forward to hearing more later. Let's turn now, though, to the youth perspective, and two good friends of ours are joining us, and thank you, Asma and David. We're joined by Asma Ruhabia and David Arinze, who are the global focal points for the Sustainable Development Goal 7 youth constituency, and they both have a lot of experience in engaging in global discussions about clean energy issues in many ways. So Asma and David, thanks for joining us. And could I ask you maybe to tell us a little bit about your experience about processes in different parts of the world, in different platforms, about engaging different voices, and obviously, particularly from your perspective, engaging youth voices in terms of how you see it going, what's working well, what have you learned about involving people in these kind of discussions?
Warm greetings, everyone. Such a delight for myself and Asma to be here. Thank you so much. Excellent moderation, I must say, by the way. It's been an exciting conversation so far and insightful for us. Definitely, we are in the midst of one of such global engagements where we are currently in Abu Dhabi, managing and organizing youth action, as preparatory activities towards the International Renewable Energy Agency Assembly, scheduled for later this week. And for us, effective youth participation is just being able to recognize the role that youths play, in advocacy, in designing policies, in providing relevant solutions and presenting their initiatives, and much more importantly, in seeing how these initiatives can scale through the relevant kind of handholding, which includes access to relevant financing, understanding the political and economic landscape within each of the countries that they either are working from or that they represent, and also knowing what the current barriers are and how to effectively engage the leaders, in being able to address these barriers. So it's such a pleasure to be here, Brian. In response to your question, I wouldn't say that there's a defined way of engaging youth, or there's a one-size-fits-all pattern towards youth engagement. But one thing that we have seen wants to be heard, especially when this space for everyone to share their initiatives, to share what the challenges are, and to ensure that you also listen with a clear objective to be able to either provide feedback, constructive feedback and insight towards how best they can better navigate their initiatives, they can better navigate the challenges that they are currently trying to surmount, and also how they can move forward, move from where they are currently to where they can be. And also, when it comes to one very important subject around policy, we are beginning to see that over the years, we have been quite intentional about providing youths with relevant webinars, capacity building initiatives, and opportunities that just help to strengthen what the subject is around policy formulation, how are policies even designed, and how do they impact on different subsets, and how can policies be reviewed? Why should policies be reviewed? In what cases are policies supposed to be set up, or policies supposed to be reviewed? And all of those sort of structures and sort of knowledge, right, is what we are very particular about, and that's what we try to ensure that those who play in the policy space, get relevant capacity building, get equipped, with relevant knowledge in order to ensure that they are going about it the right way. They are carrying out this the activities in the way that they ought to go. There are a lot of things that I would have loved to share, but at this time I would like Asma to also chime in so that I don't just steal the show. Asma, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Thank you as well, Brian and IEA, for the kind invitation. We are happy to be not representing, but sharing with you what youth perspective is and how we can further amplify the youth of young people in the energy space and the policy space globally. I'm happy to be with my colleague David, representing the SG7 youth constituency. And as he said, we are now in Abu Dhabi advocating more for the engagement of young people. And also we will be participating in Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week and organizing different youth initiatives to engage more youth in the energy space. So for our constituency, the SG7 constituency is part of the major group for children and youth, MGCY, which was mandated by the UN General Assembly. And we are a network of youth coming from different backgrounds, different countries from all around the world. And we focus, for our constituency, we focus on SG7, especially how young people can be engaged and how we can amplify the voice of young people in the multilateral system, and also how they can be engaged with their governments. What we believe in, and I personally, what I believe in when we speak about innovation, innovation is not just about technology or having the means, but innovation is a process itself. And when we speak about youth and the energy space and also the policy space, youth should be the architects of the policies and also the architects of the future, because now the future will be affecting the future generations like more. And we need to engage youth into the process of designing these policies, formulating the policies, executing the policies, and also monitoring and verifying these policies as well. And when it comes to innovation, it could be either open innovation, which means involving different stakeholders, like, for example, youth, IEA, other agencies, governments, the private sector, the public sector, etc. Or it could be a user innovation, which means youth being the innovators of the solutions that will affect their future. And this, what we have been advocating a lot with IEA, with IRENA, and different organizations, how youth could be at the forefront and youth would be the designers of these policies and these different projects, because they will be affected by them. And also considering youth as a key stakeholder, not just a beneficiary of the energy transition, but really putting youth as at the center and valuing youth voices and youth initiatives. We are honestly, for us, like, grateful to have this collaboration with IEA and further building this this relationship, and also as youth being like heard and feeling that our ideas are heard and valued is a key point for us, because it's not just about David and I or our constituency, it's about other youth that we are also trying to reach around the world, especially those in remote areas in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world that cannot advocate for themselves, and they are suffering from different issues, especially related to energy access.
Thank you very much, Asma and David. That's really interesting. And again, we're delighted to be working with you, and thank you for the opportunity to learn from you. Can I ask you about a question, or either of you a question, which is, when you see that you feel that youth voices aren't given suitable space, and youth voices aren't listened to sufficiently, what do you think are the barriers, or what do you think are the reasons for that? Is it that people neglect to include youth? Do you think there's a kind of resistance to hearing youth voices? What do you see are the barriers to greater levels of youth involvement?
Sure, I can give my own perspective and also give the time to David to share his. So in terms of barriers, some of them are the way, like, how we are able to, like, reach the youth we're not able to reach, because many youth do not hear about different opportunities, do not hear about IEA or other organizations and the work they're doing or how they can be involved. So it would be good that we can reach the furthest first, and this is what the 2030 agenda, leaving no one behind. So we also need to work hard on leaving no youth behind. In terms of governments, I believe building capacity for youth would be very important, because it's not just about education, but providing different opportunities for youth to have traineeships and different job opportunities within ministries, government agencies, or other types of organizations. This would open for youth a lot of growth opportunities. And as well, in terms of financing opportunities for young people, funding their participation for COP and different conferences, also giving them free loans to start their projects or their businesses. I believe like such kind of support would be really important. And as a young person, one of the most important things that would push me forward is feeling heard, that when we speak to senior people or high-level representatives, that we feel they hear us, they are here to really value our ideas and what we think, and not just consider us as we are like young people, we're not that experienced, and what we're saying maybe is not as like has like that value of someone who's a high level representative. We want to feel like valued, and that way youth would have more motivation. Even if they don't have enough resources, they would have more motivation to work harder and keep advocating more.
Thank you. I mean, if I may just ride on what you have said, Asma, I think one of the very key questions that organizations need to ask themselves, just like what IEA is doing, the intentionality of having youth such a very important conversation, it needs to be emulated across. It is having youth a part of this conversation just to tick a box, or actually the intent is to hear with the hope that certain key nuggets can be taken and actions can be taken afterwards. And if the intention is just to tick a box, I mean, a lot of organizations are already just trying to tick a box and like, oh yes, we heard from you. But beyond just hearing from youth, are the nuggets or the information that the youths are passing, or the things that they're sharing as the challenges, are they actually translating to meaningful activities within your organizations? Are you creating a budget, to either fund youth initiatives, or to, or even as an organization, for example, maybe you may not be able to fund youth directly, but are you ensuring that either your members, either countries, or organizations are taking active steps to create a safe space for youths in their countries? One thing I would like to mention here, that energy, no matter how you put it, it's a business. And one thing that we have learned over the period of time is that right now we try to train you to make youth understand that even when you're approaching, even if you have your initiative or programs, because we have identified that access to finance is a major challenge, and also creating relevant exposure. But we try to ensure that even in our internal meetings and even in our programming, that we ensure that youth understand that there is a business of energy, and you must approach it from a commercially viable side. But there's a lot of support that needs to happen. For example, today we have a lot of youths who are various innovators and entrepreneurs. Some of them at the early stage, growth stage, and even those at the mid-level stages. They need support. How can they galvanize support from organizations like the IEA, and how can they really, and even its allied partners and members as well? Another thing that we have seen is capacity building. Sometimes what we're trying to be intentional about is to create either materials that kind of granularize the topic of energy, because sometimes some people just think it's too complex. It's just too, sometimes it's just such a complex topic we can't get to understand it. One of the things that we have tried to do, and which we think that much more effort needs to happen, especially when it comes to youth, is being able to make this message easy to understand in the best ways we know how. Because when we talk about youth, we also not lose sight of, we have younger generations as well who may be teenagers, maybe children, and they would become youth in the very near future. And how we are ensuring that this subject of energy is part and parcel of their life. They're understanding that they're understanding concept around energy efficiency, and energy in itself, and you name it, the whole value chain. It's just important that this messaging goes wide and about so that younger generations can be captured on the very important topic. One other thing that I would like to mention about energy in itself is that we have seen that a lot of organizations as well need to ensure that in all of its youth engagement, that they are monitoring the impact, and monitoring and measuring the impact that they are making on youth, and also being able to also talk about what they're doing. For example, it's not out of place for IEA, and its partners to say, okay, this is what we are doing for you, so that others can also see and emulate. And also one of the things that I'd like to say as I try to put a break on this contribution is there is a need for exposure. For youth-led initiatives, for youth in itself, there's a need to, you see several reports have been launched, global reports, it's fine, but there should be a column where this is what youths are doing, that is just dedicated to youth. These are things that other youths can come in contact with and get to understand that, oh, actually we have a seat at the table. There's a session that is created for us. There's something that is showing that youth are making meaningful contribution to this very important topic of energy. And so these are just some of the things, just to summarize some of the barriers: access to financing, access to relevant relevant knowledge, access to relevant exposure and publicity for the issues. These are some of the issues that youth face that can help, that if they are addressed, can help ensure that youth voices and youth are much more involved, in the subject of energy. Thank you, Brian. Over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Asma. A really interesting perspective from both of you. Thank you. Let's go now to Graham Smith, who is a professor of politics and director of the Centre for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster, and also the chair of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. Graham, thank you for your patience. You've waited, but I did want you to hear from the others before we heard from you, because you have this broad perspective, particularly through the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. So maybe tell us a bit about what you're hearing, but also tell us a bit about your survey of the horizon on different approaches to climate assemblies, on similar processes, and what you're seeing happening, please.
Yeah, hello, greetings from a hotel in Brussels. The Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies was established by the European Climate Foundation, and it has a very simple ambition, which is to improve the commissioning, the design, the implementation, the follow-up, and the evaluation of climate assemblies. So climate assemblies are happening, particularly in Europe. There are about 10 national assemblies, including the one that Art mentioned in Ireland, but also over 60 or 70 have happened at municipal level. So this is a kind of what the OECD has referred to as a bit of a deliberative wave that's happening of these sorts of assemblies. And what we can say quite clearly is, from all of these, is that everyday people are willing and able, and definitely have the capacity to deliberate and produce really interesting recommendations that often far ahead of the recommendations that the ideas that are being discussed within governments on highly technical, complex and controversial issues. So there's no question that this can be done and that we can do it well. But there are sort of key I think we're beginning to see sort of key issues emerging for these things to have impact. And I think Art talked about some really important factors. I'll mention three. One is that getting the question right. Very often we ask people about too broad a question, which is, kind of, what should we do about climate, or what should we do about energy? And actually, really, we should be focusing people on very specific policy issues. Sometimes it's good to open up to broad questions, but it's also incredibly useful to bring the power of citizens' ideas into very specific policy questions. The second is we don't really know how to communicate these processes very well. We're not very good at communicating them to decision makers, to wider stakeholders, to the general public. And the third thing, and for me, this is actually become the most important thing for me is the public authorities that run these processes are very often not very well prepared for receiving the recommendations. We spend a lot of time doing democratic innovation in the sense of doing participation, and very little time doing public sector innovation and actually getting public governance ready to receive those processes. So for me, I don't actually know if we need to do much more work on how to organize a citizens' assembly. We actually need to do the work on how do we prepare public authorities to receive the recommendations of those assemblies. And just finally, referring to our colleagues, to Asma and David, they were talking about youth constituency. We're starting to see some really interesting assemblies engaging with children and young people. We've seen this in Scotland, and most recently we've seen it, and Tim may be able to say something about this, but they actually ran a children's and young people's assembly alongside the biodiversity assembly, which involved children as young as 7, from 7 to 16. And actually were able to produce really interesting recommendations that were presented to the adult assembly. And I think the really interesting thing in the future will be, can we create these intergenerational dialogues in ways that are really effective? But the take-home message for me is, we can do participation well. Are public authorities willing and ready to receive the outcomes of that process?
Thank you, Graham. And that raises the design question, because a lot of the countries we're talking about here are representative democracies. There are people whose jobs it is to be voted in by me, listen to me, and then bring my perspective in one way or the other into the decision-making process. Is deliberative democracy and direct and citizens' assemblies, is that another model of democratic decision-making bolted on awkwardly, or does it fit on well?
I think it's slightly awkward at the moment, if I'm honest. There is no reason that it should be, but I think it is awkward, because I think it's not just about representative democracy, it's also about the way that bureaucracies work. I think the logic of representative democracy and the logic of bureaucratic politics is not the same as the logic of deliberative democracy. And I think what the big challenge we've got at the moment is how to match those up. And I think we have examples of where, and Ireland is one example, of where politicians are actually really willing to give space to citizens, everyday people, to bring their ideas into the political realm. What we haven't done as well, I think, is line that up with the work of bureaucrats and the everyday work of bureaucracies and the everyday work of public administrations. I think we've got a lot of work to do there. There isn't anything to say we can't do that. It's about having the political will. It's about getting the incentives in line. It's just if you like, I think when any innovation comes along, and this is a disruptive innovation, it's bringing something else into everyday politics. And it's really, we spent a lot of time looking at the citizen aspect of it. How do we engage the citizens? And we need to spend much more time on thinking about that balance between how do we, as you were just saying there, how do we integrate it with the other aspects of politics? Now in Ireland, they seem to have done that extremely well. And I think, but each political context is going to be different. And this can also, of course, happen in sort of semi-democracies or non-representative political systems as well. We are seeing in certain countries which are not democracies, the use of these kinds of inputs into policy processes. So, you know, it's kind of being prepared. If you're going to set these things up, be prepared to respond to them. That would be my kind. That would be very simple insight.
And Graham, there was a question in the chat about asking about the applicability of models like this in more remote, poorer communities. Are there many examples in that kind of context?
So I think the principles so I think obviously in remote and poorer areas, getting these kind of doing sophisticated random sampling can be very difficult, obviously. The principle of trying to get within a room a diverse group of people who are not your everyday political leaders, who are not the leaders of particular communities, but actually the people who have lived experience, and that variety and that diversity into a room. I think that kind of principle and that kind of idea of creating a deliberative space is something that can travel, but it does require you know, if you like, a certain degree of simplification of the model. But I think the principle of diversity and deliberation, I think, does travel.
Thank you. So, Tim, let's go back to Ireland. Graham has mentioned you a couple of times there, and it's come up in a couple of questions as well. And we heard a very nice explication from Art earlier on about how Ireland has succeeded. And I know you're running the most recent one on biodiversity, which, as Graham has said, has a children's aspect as well. But can I start by asking you maybe to tell our audience a little bit about what happens in the room, because Art described the assembly of 99 citizens and the representation. What happens when you put them in the room? What do they do? What do you ask them to do?
Okay, thanks. Essentially, there's really kind of, I suppose, three parts of the process. One is hearing voices from the sector. So this is voices from various parts of biodiversity, from farmers to ecologists to policymakers to commercial interests, so that you're hearing as broad a spectrum of voices as possible, given the time constraints that you're going to have, covering as many subjects as you can within your terms of reference. And I think Graham's point about terms of reference and what they're being asked to do is really relevant, especially for complicated issues like biodiversity and energy. So that does require thought. So that, let's say in an average hour, there will be 20 minutes of people talking at the assembly members. Then for 20 minutes, the assembly members would talk amongst themselves at their tables to discuss what they've heard, what their thoughts are on it, and what questions they would then like to ask the speaker or speakers that they had listened to for the 20 minutes. So basically 20 minutes of being talked at turns into an hour, of which 40 minutes is discussion. When I started this process back in February or March, my first program for the first weekend, I had it wall to wall with speakers, and Art and Clodagh Harris, our deliberative democracy expert, tutted and went, no, no, no. And I went, well, what do you mean no? And he says, no, they need a chance to discuss things. And my view was, what are they going to discuss if they don't know anything? And I've learned over the last 9 months that they were obviously absolutely right. And that actually, Art coined this phrase at one of the early meetings was, you know, when you hear the room talking amongst themselves and you hear the volume that's going on in that discussion, Art said, deliberative democracy is a sound. It's them talking to each other. It's them bringing their own experiences, their life experiences, their professional experiences, their family experiences, their personal experiences to the conversation. They're not blank slates. They do know lots and they're bringing lots, and that's an incredibly valuable part of the process. So, and there's huge tension within the process of getting enough speakers to cover enough subjects, but allowing the citizens enough time to reflect and analyze and come up with their own recommendations. And that's very hard. I mean, in the course of our sort of 10 days, we had 85 speakers, which I think is probably, well, it's easily a record for Ireland. But given the width of the subject, we felt that was important. But even given that, we gave more time to discussion than we did to presentations. So that's vitally important. That program development is really difficult.
And then, because Art spoke about representation of different age, gender, different occupation, different geographical focus. So, but putting them in the room is one thing, but making sure those voices are equally heard is another thing, because we all have natural dynamics about who's more inclined to give their opinion, who's a better listener. So how do you flatten that out so you're genuinely hearing from 99 voices?
Right, that's actually very interesting, and it's not something I appreciated either before I started this. There's actually a sort of process that goes on behind the scenes. So let's say we have 10 tables of 10 people at each meeting. From one meeting to the next meeting, those 10 people will all be moved around. So they will be sitting with different people. At the end of each weekend meeting, there will be a debrief. So we have facilitators and note takers at each table. The facilitators are actually an incredibly important part of this process. They're the sort of gatekeepers of the democracy and the deliberative democracy process at the tables. And they would give feedback saying, okay, we had a difficulty on table 8 with A and B member. So at the next meeting, and there's a certain amount of, there's management of this, we have to move them to different tables because that's not going to work. or we may say we need a very strong facilitator at this particular table at this weekend, so that that's being moderated properly. So, and then at the end of each meeting, there is an evaluation form that the members will fill out, saying, did they feel that they had an opportunity to speak? Was there equality of voice? What, you know, was there fairness? You know, so, and we would then review that at the end of each meeting to see if there are any issues. So there's a whole part of that that goes on in the background, which is actually really interesting and a critical part of the process. But for people who are not involved in it, it's not apparent that it is actually happening, but it is essential. I think Graham probably would anyone who's been in these processes, I'm sure it's a central part of them all, really. Graham and Shirley, I think, probably would be similar experiences with that.
Thank you, Tim. And actually, let me go back to Shirley on that point, because I'm interested, maybe Shirley, to say a bit more about when your focus is on Indigenous communities, and I wonder whether that makes the process different, either in process or in substance. If you bring together a room full of people to engage on a particular topic, and they're all from Indigenous communities, would it look to an outsider exactly like if it was a room full of any Canadian citizens, or do you design the process differently, and does the conversation go in different directions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I think that Graham was hitting the nail on the head when he was talking about it's one thing to create space in order to hear from citizens, whether in the case of myself, I'm talking about the Indigenous peoples, but it's another thing for it to actually influence policy and move it forward. And in Canada, with the Indigenous peoples in Canada, it's a nation-to-nation relationship. So, you know, Canada enters it on an equal foot with the nation that you're dealing with versus, you know, as a representative body. And there's a couple of items I'd like to highlight that we've done that I think are moving towards incorporating the views of Indigenous peoples in policy development and project development. And one is 2 massive pipeline projects in Canada. And it came from consulting with Indigenous people themselves that they wanted a role in the life cycle of the project, not just in talking about what are the impacts, how they can be mitigated, and what could be the benefits to Indigenous communities. So in coordination with, and it was 2 separate companies in Canada that had the pipelines. So in coordination with them and the Government of Canada and the Indigenous communities who were directly impacted by these projects, they have set up, it's called Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committees. And both of these committees have Indigenous caucuses that have memberships that includes their chiefs and their councillors and their tribal chiefs, regional directors from Métis Nations and other high-profile individuals, but also the Government of Canada and the proponent themselves are involved. And it provides really important space for Indigenous voices to participate in the project over the life cycle. And we've seen in the last 5 years since these were set up, some really important advances. One was that Indigenous people are trained as monitors to be able to monitor the project as it's constructed and as it moves into operation. The second would be that government and the regulator and the Indigenous communities themselves are able to work together to respond to issues of environmental protection and practices that then can incorporate the Indigenous perspectives and traditional knowledge of the environment in the area. And the third is that Indigenous communities themselves are increasing their technical capacity to participate in the projects and to participate in what projects should develop in the future. The second is a fairly new initiative of the Government of Canada, and it's called Regional Energy Resource Tables. That's hard for me to say. So I'll just say regional tables. And these are set up, they've been launched now in 9 jurisdictions. So in Canada, we've got 10 provinces, 3 territories. Eventually, there'll be one in all 13 jurisdictions. But we've also are in the process of setting up separate tables for Indigenous leadership. And this is to actually start with identifying what are the clean energy transition priorities for the Indigenous groups in each of the locations. What will be the barriers to the development? What impacts are unacceptable or must be mitigated? How can impacts to development be accommodated if they can't be mitigated? And also, how can we make it sustainable? Because in most Indigenous cultures in Canada, you talk about the 7 generations. So it's not just about this project, and it's not about the life of the project. It's about looking forward 7 generations and how can this development be sustainable to the 7 generations in the future.
Thank you, Shirley. That's really interesting. Colleagues, time is upon us. I'm sorry if we had twice as much time, I still wouldn't have run out of all the questions I have for you, because you've raised so many interesting points and so many interesting examples. So I really want to thank all of you as our speakers, Shirley, Art and Tim, Yonji, Arianto, Asma and David and Graham. You've been very generous with your time and your wisdom, and I really do appreciate it. And to everybody who stayed with us, I really thank you for participating in this webinar. Let you know that this is part of an ongoing series we have here in the IEA under our People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions Program. So we're keen to stay in touch with all of you, hear your views on these issues. Do please continue to talk to us about these things. And of course, let us know if there are issues or topics or projects or examples you'd like us to explore in these webinars or in our ongoing work. So we hope this is just another step in an ongoing conversation with all of you on these really important issues. So with that, let me once again thank all of our speakers for their wonderful interventions and bring today's webinar to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian and everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
Brian.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.